Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we're pleased to have Brendan Carr, a U.S. Federal Communications Commissioner. Commissioner Carr joined the FCC in 2012 and then was presidentially appointed as one of the 5 commissioners in 2017. He's had over 20 years of public and private sector experience in U.S. policies with regards to communications and technology, one of the most fast-changing policy areas facing Washington, D.C. today. Welcome, Commissioner Carr.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much. Had a wonderful recent visit to Taiwan and look forward to discussing the very key and valuable relationship between the United States and Taiwan.
Yeah, you mentioned you were just in Taiwan, and you were the very first FCC commissioner to ever visit the country. Tell us why you went, your findings, and perhaps explain to our audience what your role is at FCC.
Well, look, I think a free and independent Taiwan, a democratic Taiwan, is vital to America's own economic interests, to our security interests. And so I think it's incumbent on every official in the U.S. to work to see where, even in small ways like myself, we can deepen the relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I had a virtual meeting a few months ago with then Commissioner Soon of the National Communications Commission, which is the counterpart to the FCC where I work. And then she and others invited me to follow that up with an in-person visit. And as you mentioned, I was the first FCC commissioner to do that. And I thought that was very important. We collaborated on a lot of issues. We do these types of meetings with different countries all over the globe where we meet and we discuss our shared issues, whether it's cybersecurity, network resiliency, 5G, spectrum. And it's always very beneficial to me in my job here at the FCC to hear from my regulatory counterparts abroad.
So thank you for setting the precedent. You recently spoke about banning the popular app TikTok. Why should the government focus on banning TikTok, especially when it has been downloaded more than 200 million times in America? Is it even feasible?
Yeah, it is. So TikTok is immensely popular in the U.S., less so in Taiwan from my experience over there. And a lot of people look at it, as you mentioned, and millions of Americans are on it. And they think, well, it's just a fun platform for sharing videos or dance memes. But the reality is it functions as a very sophisticated surveillance operation. It harvests everything from search and browsing history to keystroke patterns to potentially can collect biometrics, including face prints and voice prints. And for years, TikTok officials told regulators like me in the US that the data is simply stored outside of China. In some cases, they said it's not even accessible by Beijing. And there was a blockbuster report that came out a couple months ago that showed no, in fact, based on internal communications, everything is seen inside Beijing. And that's a problem, whether it's for foreign influence, espionage. There's been new reports about people in Beijing using the application to track the specific locations of US users. So there's a lot to be worried here from a national security perspective. And I do think the US government, through our Treasury Department, which looks at this type of stuff, should step in. And I just don't see a path forward right now for something short of a ban, given a lot of the misleading statements that TikTok has been making about data flows.
Well, if banning TikTok is a way to secure data access from the Chinese government, does that mean other companies or other similar apps that basically serve as platform between the US and China and even other places in the world should be banned as well?
We need to look at all of this. We need a top to bottom review. We've taken a lot of action at the FCC. For instance, we've moved on Huawei, ZTE, China Mobile, China Telecom, China Unicom, and we sort of take each case on its own merits, take a look at the data flow, see if there's any nefarious conduct going on, assess national security risks, and move forward. But I do think we need to not just be looking at these individual companies, but taking a much broader look. DJI, the Shenzhen-based drone company, is another one that I have flagged that probably deserves a bit more attention here in the US. But we are taking an appropriately tough stance on entities that may be beholden to the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, you mentioned ZTE, Huawei, and DJI. Our understanding is that they're also now on the Secure Equipment Act's cover list, meaning their new equipments are to be banned, according to various news reports. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so DJI is not on that list at this point, but the other ones are. So up to now, being on our covered list, what it's meant is you can't take federal dollars, federal subsidies to purchase that equipment. But what I identified a year or so ago was what I call the Huawei loophole, meaning that companies could buy Huawei gear with their own money, buy the same gear, put it in the same point in the network. And our previous actions on Huawei and ZTE didn't stop that. So what I said we needed to do was look at our equipment authorization process. In other words, there's no piece of electronics that can enter the US or be used here lawfully if it's not approved by the FCC. And so we're in the final stages right now with the FCC of finalizing a proceeding that would potentially, if we adopt it, block, to your point, future Huawei, ZTE, and covered list entities from having their gear approved for use in the US. That'll be the first time that we would have taken a national security step in the context of equipment authorization. And I think it'd be a very good thing, and it's something that has my support. It hasn't been publicized yet at the FCC. We're still sort of finalizing our approach to that.
Well, as we speak, President Biden and President Xi just met in Bali a few years ago on the margin of G20. This comes back to the bigger question: how does the U.S. really compete with China on telecommunications and information technology in the long term, not just because of national security? And there is actually a perception that the U.S. government is kneecapping Chinese technology companies in the name of national security. Do you agree with that statement and approach?
Look, I'm happy to compete and have a level playing field. The reality is, though, what we've seen to date with Huawei, with ZTE, with similar entities is very nefarious conduct that involves national security threats. And so all the actions we've taken to date right now have been limited to that extent. But there's more that we need to keep doing. We've recently taken actions on chips to make sure that we don't have advanced chips flowing into Beijing for potentially use for nefarious purposes. I think we also need to take a look at access potentially by Beijing to US-based cloud computing services. At the end of the day, if you cut off the flow of advanced chips to Beijing, they're going to look to replace a lot of that computing power for AI and other activities with access to cloud-based computing. So I think we need to pair some of our action on the chipset side with some of our action on the cloud side. But look, I think reciprocity is a great place to start for international relations in given all the limits that are in place on Beijing with U.S. entities doing business. I think that's something to consider. But again, up to now, our actions have been limited and driven by national security concerns.
Well, some in the private sector, especially, sort of after the most recent export control policy coming out of the Commerce, some have argued and questioned whether this kind of approach can really be effective. Or would it actually compel China to double down, investing in its own technological advantages and be less reliant and more independent in the future? What do you think about that approach? Or, should the U.S. be more focused on investing in domestic capabilities like what the CHIPS Act intends to do, as you alluded to? How do we balance the two approaches?
It's a good question. When I was in Taiwan a little while ago, I had the opportunity to visit Hsinchu and see a lot of the heartland of Taiwan's semiconductor industry, and these were a lot of concerns that were raised. In my view, at the end of the day, Beijing is going to be working to develop its own independent chip manufacturing capacity, its own independent cloud-based services, its own independent AI operation. And so I think to the extent that we can, cut off some of the flows of chips and others to Beijing, I think it's a good thing, because at the end of the day, Beijing is already working to stand up its own parallel system here. And I'm not sure why we should be aiding them and accelerating that transition. But to your point, we also need to be diversifying and investing. Right now, 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors are produced right there in Taiwan. And I think that's a good thing. I think the work that Taiwan's doing right now is irreplaceable in terms of the ICT supply sector. There's some diversification going on. TSMC is opening up increasingly advanced operations actually in Phoenix and Arizona in the US. And I view that all, though, as complementary to the job that's taking place right there on the island.
Well, shifting to another important debate in America, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that generally shields website platforms' responsibility with regards to a third-party content, meaning platforms like Facebook or Twitter can say they're not responsible for the content on their platforms. There's been a lot of advocacy to change that particular regulation due to bots, disinformation, misinformation, and some even cite foreign interference in U.S. elections. What is your view?
Well, if you look at Taiwan as an example, it has such a bright, vibrant, competitive news and journalism industry. And the idea there is we fully embrace free speech. And I think that's what we need to do in the U.S. And when it comes to Section 230 into internet platforms, we have the concentration of control over speech, and we see a lot of censorship, including of political views. My perspective is we do need Section 230 reform because courts, I think, in the U.S. have misinterpreted it to give, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or others, basically a blank check to censor different political perspectives at will. And I think we're better off as a country if we embrace a diversity of views, if we hear differing, unorthodox political, scientific, religious views. So I think we need to get back to this idea of the internet being a digital town square where everyone's voices are free to be heard. I don't think censorship is a good thing, and I don't think it helps us solve our most pressing problems as a country. So we have to take an idea, flip it around, look at it from all perspectives, air all views. I think that's how we solve problems. So I think we have work to do in the U.S. on Section 230 reform to ensure that the internet continues to be home for a diversity of views, not just those that reflect the companies that own a handful of these internet platforms.
I think on that, U.S. and Taiwan have a lot to share with each other because Taiwan also, during presidential elections, faced a lot of sort of suspected foreign interference coming from mainland China. Going back to the question of the U.S., how do you view Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter? How is it going to change the landscape of social media and freedom of speech? Do you think President Trump will return to Twitter? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know about that latter one. On the first question, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that Elon Musk's embrace of free speech, of diversity of views, will bend Twitter's content moderation policies in that direction. But I also don't think we should just hope that a billionaire happens to be benevolent and engages in an embrace of free expression. That's why I still think we need to put in place pro-speech guardrails at the federal level. And so that would be accountability, transparency, anti-discrimination. So you can't discriminate against viewpoints, user empowerment to let people decide what they want to hear on the internet rather than having the company decide and do the content moderation. Let's let an individual do their own content moderation, choose what they want to see and what they don't see. So my view on Elon Musk purchases, I'm hopeful, but I don't think we should just hope alone. I still think we need to put Section 230 reforms in place.
And do you think President Trump should return to Twitter? Do you think banning him was the right decision by Twitter?
Going forward, that's going to be up to Twitter and Elon Musk, and Facebook has their own content moderation policy on that. They have their own oversight board that's taking a look at that, and they're working through those issues right now.
And what kind of relationship should Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. have? How do we work with the rest of the world on setting telecom standards and norms?
Yeah, I think we have to work together at this point. If you look at sort of the standard setting process in general, Beijing has been engaged pretty deeply in an effort to infiltrate a lot of the standard setting bodies across the globe. And I think that's, potentially a dangerous trend that we need to call out and that we need to have a coordinated response to addressing. And so I think that's where, deeper ties between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. coordinating in the standard setting process, not the content moderation side, but the standard setting process could be very valuable.
Well, hopefully Taiwan, Taipei can also be part of those important conversations. On that note, thank you so much. These are really urgent policy matters that concern both national security and U.S. technology competitiveness that will require much more understanding and communications between industry and policy leaders. So thank you for speaking to TVBS today, Commissioner Carr. Take care.
Thank you. Appreciate it.